they're inheriting a hugely difficult situation internationally and internally. I won't be going out to put a large bet one way or the other on the way it'll go.
We're about a week now into the new administration's first week in office. What early signals have been sent out to the likes of the UK and the EU regarding what the US's new foreign policy priorities are going to be?
Well, I think the first message is that despite the fact they had very little cooperation from the outgoing Trump administration, that they've had quite detailed plans, and that you've got a very experienced crowd, very well qualified for the jobs they're going into, entering office and rolling out a well advertised program. So I mean, I'm not exactly surprised by what I've seen, but I'm encouraged by it, because I think that it's showing that the building blocks are gradually being put in place. And I think the message from the inaugural address onwards was what was advertised during the campaign, on the campaign trail, which is that this is going to be an administration, as you'd expect, since it's made up of people who've been in Democrat politics for the last 20, 30 years. It's going to be an administration which has a more traditional view of American foreign policy interests, will approach it on the basis of collaboration and coalition building in a traditional way with allies, international institutions, and so on, will try, as is normally done in diplomacy, to find a balanced way of expressing your national interest on tricky issues. Won't try and do what the Trump administration did, and veer from one side to the other on the same issue, often from day to day, without finding that consistent path, which I think is the only way to keep allies with you. Because if you're working with allies, you need to have that predictability about your policies. Otherwise, where the hell do they look, and where do they turn to when they want some sort of North Star from their alliance leader? Not one that they're always going to blindly follow, but they want to know where their alliance leader stands. But my last point would be, I think this is also an administration which realizes they can't just turn back the clock to the Obama administration, where many of them worked together. And indeed, they haven't got such short memories that they'll think that the Obama administration was a walk in the rose garden, because it was in many ways quite problematic in foreign policy terms, not as much as Trump, but it was a period of adjustment and change in American foreign policy after the recession and after Iraq and Afghanistan. It was a period which left some of American allies at least scratching their heads and wondering whether America was using this concept of strategic reticence to mask a sort of a preliminary withdrawal from its classic involvement in world affairs. And it started a new policy towards China and the Asia Pacific under the Asia Pivot, many of whose authors are now back in this administration, which ultimately didn't work, and which they're clearly going to reset to some extent. So I think they know that the world has moved. They know there's a new center of gravity on China. They know that America has more to prove in terms of its dependability and potency, really, as an actor in foreign policy. They know things have moved on, and that people are thinking in a more post-American way, to use that jargon phrase, because of what's happened in the last couple of decades, and because of Trump. I mean, both have accentuated. Trump has accentuated an existing trend. So, and I don't think we yet know quite how different it will be. So far, the early signs are of relative continuity with Obama-like policies. But on China, on a number of other things, clearly things are moving, and there's a new reality they're going to have to grapple with.
did you make of Trump? What did you make of his past 4 or 5 years? Did it go as you expected it would do?
Depends which moment you're comparing. I mean, did it go as I expected it would do when he was elected? No, it's been much worse. I mean, I'm afraid I was always a relative pessimist on the spectrum of people watching the Trump administration. I always feared it would be exceptionally difficult. But the degree of volatility, the degree of particularly in relation to domestic politics and the risks taken with the American Constitution and the challenge to the Constitution, that side of it definitely surprised me. In international policy, I think it was worse than I'd expected, partly because I think a lot of us had banked on the idea that some of the senior and experienced people that he managed to get into the administration first time round, that they would exert an influence on him in the normal way, and would knock some of the edges off, pure Trumpian policy. And of course, pretty much from day one, it didn't work out like that. Let Trump be Trump was the slogan infecting the whole administration, and the extent of that. The absence of any sense of someone growing into the job or realizing his responsibilities or seeing things differently from the way he saw them as a campaigner, which is what normally human nature does to someone assuming high office. That didn't happen with Trump at all. So I think it was worse, although, as I say, I was not expecting a presidency full of statecraft and political achievement. I always thought it would be a bumpy ride, but it was much worse than I'd expected.
I should have probably clarified in that question. I meant from the time that he was, being sworn in on the book. I think that was probably.
Well, that's really what I was talking about as well.
Yeah.
At that point, I think I would have said at that moment, with people like Tillerson and Mattis and a few other people capable of adult supervision on the scene, that it might have gone differently. And we knew that people, that members of his family, that his daughter, for example, carried some influence with him, and it was at least possible at that stage that on the Paris Agreement, that those in the administration, like his daughter, who wanted, we were told, the United States to stay in the Paris Accord, might have some impact on him. But in the end, he went against everybody, including his family, on that subject, and pretty rapidly, without any real debate. It was, as usual, decision by tweet.
Do you mention in your letter that the world is now more disorderly than ever, and that the Biden administration, aren't going into the same world that they were with Obama?
Yeah.
How difficult is the challenge for Western allies to build back these bridges that have been burnt in the past 5 years? And are some of the gaps too big now?
I think they're certainly big, and I just don't think we can tell yet whether this is a hopeless cause or not. I don't think it's a hopeless cause. I think there'll be some change. Huge relief in allied capitals, not just Western European. I think around the world, for having a more consistent and predictable set of people, governing American policy. But I think here in Europe, as I said in my letter, I think there are some, conflicting currents really, because I mean, Europe, no one in Europe could work out how to deal with Trump. Early on, you had Macron, a little bit like our government of the day, trying to reach out to him and to some degree appease him. That plainly didn't work over time. He was rebuffed on a number of occasions. The Merkel approach looked like the only one which really worked, which was aloofness from him, and without any attempt to disguise the moral as well as political and policy differences. And her approach, which I suppose you could say was risky in the sense that it reinforced Trump's antagonism towards her, which was always extreme and and irrational, frankly, did seem in the end to be the best way, and certainly the, arguably the morally better way of handling the Trump administration. So no one got it right during the Trump period. In the process, I think what happened in Europe and a lot of other places was everyone went into damage limitation mode. And started to prepare for an America which is now pausing. If America carried on down the Trump path, it couldn't have played a consistently positive or coherent role in the world. It wasn't doing under Trump, and it wouldn't have done in the next 4 years. With Biden, there was at least the chance of that. And I think plainly he's going to work with allies, whatever happens, on all the big issues of the day, as Americans traditionally do. But most of the questions go back to America itself. Already in the Obama administration, you could even say at the end of the Bush administration, people were rethinking America's role in the world after the events of the noughties. Fareed Zakaria, the American, very influential American commentator, journalist, wrote his book, The Post-American World, in I think 2008. It's a long time ago now. So the idea that you're dealing with two major forces in international life, China and to some degree the other newer powers rising, and America and the West economically and in other ways in some form of retreat. That's been around for some time and was sharpened by Obama's caution and deliberate distancing from the interventionist policies of his predecessor. So I think it comes back to America, and probably after the events of the last year, and particularly 6th of January and everything else, the key issue for America is whether they can reestablish some form of social and political compact within the United States, which is essential for American internal policymaking and the calm and good sense of its internal order. But actually, no country can be an international leader if it's totally divided and at odds with itself, and all its energies are consumed trying to put out fires, in America's case, almost literally, in its home area. And to some degree, that's one of the UK's problems, and it's in the UK's foreign policy for the last period since the Brexit referendum and for the next few years, the extent to which we can match the dream that the government has of a global Britain against the fact that our own politics have become so degraded, so divisive, and so bitter that we don't have the bandwidth for much innovation externally. And as other countries look at us, we look like a diminished force because of the internal divisions which any government in the UK is going to be grappling with for some time now.
It's interesting you mentioned global Britain. I wanted to come on to that rhetoric. Do you think it's damaged the UK's standing in the Western world? And if so, then could you quantify by how much?
Look, I think that whatever the analysis you have of the Brexit referendum, what the government has failed to internalize is that, rightly or wrongly, most of the rest of the world couldn't understand the decision we'd made, thought it was not the Britain and the British people that they thought they understood, and then watched with a sort of horror watch the sort of movie show of the next 4 years as they watched most of the things they believed about the UK disintegrating under their eyes. Keep calm and carry on, and all that was the exact opposite of what they saw. Two events, of course, drew a lot of international interest: prorogation of Parliament and the willingness to disregard international law over the Northern Ireland part of the Brexit deal. Those are things which do have an international meaning. and so on. So I think that the problem with global Britain was not the concept, because to be honest, it's not a new concept. It's a concept which most governments, we go back the whole of the time I was a public servant, in one way or other. If you ask Margaret Thatcher whether she believed in global Britain, of course she would have said yes, and marketed the UK extremely aggressively outside Europe and America. So it goes back a long way. The problem was the hollowness of that claim at a time when we were struggling internally, where our politics were so divided, and where our relationship with our key partner, seen by the rest of the world as our key partner, i.e. the European Union, the major force in our own continent, where they were going through a major crisis. And the deal which was done on Christmas Eve, to my mind, is a 1.0 sort of deal, a minimalist deal, worth having, but there's a hell of a long way there's a long way to go to get us to the sort of relationship which I think will command respect with other world players. They would, I think, certainly our allies would prefer us to have a much closer and more coherent relationship as a sovereign state now outside the EU with the European Union. By the way, I should say I didn't think we were not a sovereign state before, so I was maybe absorbing a little too quickly the government's rhetoric on that.
Okay. You said as well that Britain has to overcome lingering doubts about in Washington about Brexit.
Yeah,
it doesn't seem like, from what I could see from the recent EU-UK trade deal, that the UK has a huge appetite to move closer to the EU at the moment. How far do you think the UK would go to moving close to the EU in order to appease the US, if that makes sense?
I think there's a paradox here, which is that on the substance of the big issues of the day, for the most part, the UK in the last 4 years has agreed with Europe, and Europe's agreed with the UK on climate change. The UK has, if anything, in the last few months, and particularly with this COP meeting in Glasgow ahead, it would be difficult to find a fundamental difference between Boris Johnson's approach and that of the European Commission, France and Germany. I don't know about the Central European countries, but there seems to be a huge amount of alignment and placing us in a good position to work with John Kerry and President Biden. If you look at the really difficult issues of the last few years in foreign policy, Iran, Israel, Palestine, handling Russia, on those issues, the UK and Europe have been at one. And Boris Johnson, as Foreign Secretary, as Prime Minister, continue to argue for America to re-enter the old Iran nuclear deal. I think on China, it's been a little bit less clear, and this is an area where clearly a lot of transatlantic dialogue now needs to take place, because the Americans need to work out where they are. As I said before, I don't think it's going to be turning back the clock to the Asia pivot of 2011 of the Obama administration. But even that policy, it wasn't soft on China, the Asia pivot. It accepted, as I think that Biden and his lieutenants will today, that this relationship with China is a huge and complex one. There are elements of competition and elements even of confrontation, but also a lot of cooperation and sort of coexistence involved in it. And what I think they will go for is a steadier middle path in that. They will set the dial somewhere different from where the Obama administration did, but it won't be the oscillation which you saw with Trump. I mean, Trump one day was praising President Xi to the skies as one of his closest friends and someone he hugely admired. The next day, almost literally sometimes, was slapping hundreds of billions of dollars of tariffs on Chinese goods. So I think Biden will try to join the dots, bring allies with him, not just Europe, but all America's Asia Pacific allies as well, which is one of the strengths of American policy. So and on China, the point I was making really was that in the Trump period, Britain was probably positioned closer to the Europeans, but somewhere between the Trump position and the European position. But the European position itself was quite complex, with some taking a tougher line, for example, on Huawei than others. So I think, winding the clock forward to the end of last year, if I'd been in Ursula von der Leyen's shoes, I think I would have hit the pause button on the new investment agreement with China, with Biden coming in, because I just think it may give the wrong signal and point the EU in a more opposed direction to America than maybe is ideal at this point, where you need to be co-strategizing on the most important long-term issue in the world, which is the America-China relationship and the EU-China relationship. So I think that was maybe a short-sighted move. I can see why it was done. And I worry that this concept of strategic autonomy that Europe has developed, partly because of Trump, it's also, it's a long-standing thing, particularly on in French thinking about Europe, but and there are different variants of strategic autonomy. Some make a great deal of sense, provided Europe is genuinely willing to put the capabilities to improve and enrich the capabilities, defense and other, available. But if it means, as President Macron recently said explicitly, an equidistance for Europe to be equidistant between America and China, then I think that would be fundamentally wrong. We can't be equidistant in values between America and China. We can't be, on security issues, on so many of the tech issues. We've got to find a way through this. And it ought to be not with an identical policy to the United States, but we ought to be more aligned with them. So Europe, the EU I'm talking about, has to get its head straight on these issues and work out what its priorities are. And the UK, I think, is actually probably positioned reasonably well to work with the Biden administration if we can be taken seriously after the Brexit saga. And as I said, it's not vindictiveness on Biden's part. He's shown already that he's willing to have a good relationship with Boris Johnson. He's put him at the head of the European queue in his phone calls. I mean, that's great. But in the administration, they genuinely believe, as foreign policy practitioners, that Brexit was a terrible mistake. They'll see the deal as the minimum necessary to avoid a catastrophe. And they'll want to see us behaving in the way they know the UK can, pragmatically, and looking after our long-term interests, not continuing this internal focus that we've had on political theory and sovereignty, preventing us cooperating in practice with our nearest partners.
A lot's been made of, you did mention just now about how the UK was ahead in the queue in terms of the US are looking to be pragmatic in terms of working with the UK, but a lot has been made of Biden's kind of personal feelings towards Boris Johnson. There was a lot of I think I saw John Soper asking about the Churchill bust, and there's been lots of talk. There was a lot of talk in the autumn about how Biden might be quite frosty towards the PM. How receptive do you feel he will personally be to Boris Johnson? And what would he have to do to win the heart of Joe Biden?
Well, he's already made, as I say, I know Biden reasonably well. I don't think he's a vindictive person. I think he will do what he thinks is right for the United States, and his natural style is a friendly style. So I think that can be exaggerated. I think that equally on the other side, they are two very different political personalities in age, in experience, in temperament. It doesn't look like a match made in heaven, but you can surprise on the upside. I mean, no one looking at Tony Blair and George W. Bush in 2000 or 2001, when George Bush entered office, would have said that they would have not only formed a very close military alliance, but would actually have got on extremely well at a personal level, despite continuing policy differences. So So, I mean, I think it's, we'll have to see how that beds down, but I wouldn't expect it to be a notably scratchy relationship. I think one thing we've got to get into our heads here in the UK is that when America looks to Europe now, we've left the European Union. The EU is, but the most important show in town in Europe, certainly economically, and for a lot of other reasons as well. And a little bit like a decade ago during the Euro crisis. Obviously, the UK was never in the Euro. We're never going to be now, and we're no longer in the EU. So when America looks over the Atlantic, they're going to want to work collaboratively, mainly with the Germans. They'll be the key ally of the United States, as they've been arguably for the last decade. Angela Merkel is going this year, so that creates an element of doubt about personal relationships, but that will clearly be Biden's first port of call. He'll know Angela Merkel extremely well. There's this annual security conference in Munich, which is just about to take place, actually, which Biden used to go to as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and vice president extremely regularly. So he knows Germany. It'll be Merkel and Macron, and of course Boris Johnson will be an important partner. But he's not going to be the only European, with a close relationship with the Biden administration. And the other thing which maybe we lack a little bit, as you look at our government, we lack a little bit of we lack heavyweights in their fields. If you look around our government compared with the American administration, which is coming in, you look at their Secretary of State, you look at their Treasury Secretary, you look at their Defense Secretary, you look at most people in the administration. These are people with a huge amount of expertise and experience in their areas. And our government just does not look like that at the moment, with some exceptions. That isn't the case in the key positions in our government. So that won't help Boris Johnson as he's trying to create this close relationship with Joe Biden. But I think that I think it helps. It's the luck of the draw, but we do happen to be chairing these two meetings in the UK this year. That helps. It helped Gordon Brown in 2009 that he was the chair of the G20 and got Obama over to London in April of his first year in power. So these things can help, and I'd expect relations to be close, but probably in personal terms, Biden has a pre-existing relationship with Merkel, and for the first 6 to 9 months of his administration, Merkel's going to be around.
We've talked a lot about what is needed for effective coalition building, and obviously for the UK this year, it's quite a big year. We've got the G7, which is very bizarrely in Cornwall, and we've also got COP26 in Glasgow. How do you see this playing out over the next year? Do you think it's going to go well for the UK?
Look, I mean, we're normally very good at these events, and the G7, G7 agendas. It's quite difficult to remember what the last 5 years of G7 meetings have really, brought about. Obviously, that's been the Trump period, so maybe he probably hasn't helped a great deal. I mean, I think the COP meeting, in substantive terms, is a much more material event internationally, and there have been huge doubts in the NGO world and international organizational world about Britain's capacity to pull this one off. I mean, partly because it's been a moving target because of COVID, the timing's been awkward, and the British organisation has been rather shambolic until recently. So I think the question is whether Alok Sharma, he clearly hasn't got the experience, but whether he has the mettle and the team behind him to make a go of this and be respected internationally and have the dynamism in the team, the energy in the team, to bring about some sort of international agreement. The core of that, as in Paris, is probably an American-Chinese core. So it would have been very, very difficult to fashion an agreement with the Trump administration, probably impossible, because they wouldn't have been at the table, and there would have been no, as it were, pressure on China really to do much more than repeat what they've said already. But I think now with John Kerry, and John Kerry is already active. I mean, I know this from a number of sources. He's already busy, actively courting international interlocutors and so on. I think the core of it will be that, and whether Alok Sharma can match the people that the EU, the US, China, and the other major countries will put into this. On the EU side, Frans Timmermans is the European Commission Vice President who's in charge of this, who's a hugely experienced and impressive politician. There are some big players around, and I think Alok Sharma has a lot to prove, and a lot on his shoulders. But I would think a very, very good team of scientists, advisors, negotiators behind him. I'm encouraged by what I've seen so far of the administration, and I think they have a sense of perspective and history about where they are and what's feasible. I think the foundations of something different are there, but it's going to be but they're inheriting a hugely difficult situation internationally and internally. I won't be going out to put a large bet one way or the other on the way it'll go.